"Get out and stay out," my father yelled. The heavy crystal goblet in his hand shook, sloshing red wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff, custom-tailored collar. He pointed a rigid finger directly toward the heavy oak front doors of the estate. Around the grand dining table, 20 of my relatives sat perfectly frozen, their expensive silver forks suspended in mid-air. They were throwing me out for dropping out of medical school, in their eyes. I was a disgraced failure, a parasite tarnishing 3 generations of pristine medical pedigree. I did not beg for their understanding. I did not cry. I simply picked up my faded coat and walked out into the freezing rain. They thought they had entirely erased me from the family narrative. They did not know I was currently worth $68,400,000. The very next day, I moved into my Manhattan penthouse. 5 weeks later, the medical empire they worshipped would collapse entirely, and I would be the one holding the demolition controls. Have you ever been cast aside by family who judged your path before seeing your destination? Let me know in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogance always pays a heavy, unavoidable price. My name is Quinn. I am 28 years old. The eruption that ended my presence in the Bellamy family occurred on a Tuesday evening, during my parents' 30th wedding anniversary dinner. I had spent the last 3 years avoiding these mandatory gatherings, but my mother, Sylvia, had texted me a strict demand to attend. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple, faded gray sweater. The moment I crossed the threshold, I realized my attendance was merely required, so they had a prop to contrast against their own manufactured perfection. The dining room of their suburban estate was a suffocating display of excess. Towering floral arrangements obstructed the sightlines across the long mahogany table. A private catering staff in crisp white uniforms circulated silently, pouring vintage champagne into crystal flutes. My father, Dr. Everett Bellamy, sat at the head of the table. He was a prominent cardiothoracic surgeon who treated medicine not as a calling, but as a vehicle for absolute social dominance. He wore a bespoke navy suit, commanding the conversation with loud boasts about his surgical volume and his influential patient roster. To his right sat my older brother, Grayson. He was 31 years old and a neurosurgery resident. Grayson spent the entire first hour of the dinner aggressively swirling his expensive bourbon, loudly taking credit for diagnoses made by his attending physicians. He wore a heavy gold luxury watch that caught the glare of the chandelier every time he raised his glass. My mother, a cosmetic dermatologist who worshipped social hierarchies, sat to my father's left, nodding in performative adoration at every boast the men made. I was seated at the extreme far end of the table, placed squarely between 2 distant cousins who actively avoided making eye contact with me. I ate my meal in total silence, focusing on the rhythmic clinking of silverware against porcelain. I did not want a confrontation. I just wanted the evening to end. But my father required an audience for his superiority. As the catering staff cleared the main courses, Everett tapped his silver spoon against his champagne flute. The sharp, metallic ringing instantly silenced the low murmurs of the 20 relatives gathered in the room. He stood up, puffing his broad chest outward. "Tonight, we celebrate 3 decades of the Bellamy medical legacy," Everett began, his voice projecting as if he were addressing a crowded lecture hall. "A legacy built on relentless excellence. Grayson is currently securing a highly competitive fellowship, carrying our name into the next generation of surgical dominance." A polite ripple of applause washed over the table. Grayson leaned back in his chair, a smug, self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. He raised his bourbon glass to acknowledge the praise. Everett did not sit down. Instead, he shifted his gaze down the long stretch of mahogany, locking his cold eyes directly onto me. The performative warmth in his voice completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, cutting edge of pure disdain. "And then, we have the reality check," Everett stated, his tone dropping into a lethal, mocking register. The polite smiles around the table instantly evaporated. The room grew incredibly tense. My mother leaned back, subtly crossing her arms and pressing her lips together in a tight, disapproving line. "It has been exactly 3 years since Quinn walked out of her medical residency," my father continued, gesturing lazily in my direction with his champagne flute. 3 years since she abandoned a premium education that I personally paid for. She traded a pristine white coat to sit in front of a computer screen, claiming she is working in data. He let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. It contained absolutely zero humor. Data, he scoffed, shaking his head. A glorified secretary staring at spreadsheets while the rest of us actively save lives. We cure diseases. We build empires. You sit in the shadows. Quinn, you contribute absolutely nothing to this family's prestige. You are a parasite feeding off the oxygen in this room. The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked around the table. 20 adults. People who had known me my entire life. Simply stared down at their pristine white linen napkins. No one offered a single word of defense. Grayson actively smirked, picking up his steak knife to cut another piece of meat, entirely entertained by my public degradation. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fists against the mahogany table or demand respect. Respect cannot be extracted from people who base their entire self-worth on tearing others down. I simply placed my linen napkin beside my plate. I pushed my chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraping with a dull, heavy thud against the polished hardwood floor. I stood up to my full height. "Get out and stay out," my father yelled, misinterpreting my silence for weakness. His face twisted into a mask of absolute disgust. "If you cannot uphold the standard of this family, you have no place at this table." I did not offer him the satisfaction of a reaction. I turned my back on the head of the table. I walked methodically to the front entryway, retrieved my faded gray coat from the brass rack, and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The freezing winter rain hit my face the exact second I stepped onto the stone porch. I walked down the brick driveway to my car, unlocking the door and sliding into the cold driver's seat. I started the engine, letting the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers serve as the only sound in the quiet cab. As I drove away from the sprawling suburban estate, I felt absolutely no sorrow. I felt a terrifying, absolute clarity. They genuinely believed I was a destitute failure. They had no idea that while they were busy curating their flawless aristocratic illusions, I was quietly building the digital infrastructure their entire medical network relied upon. I merged onto the highway, driving steadily toward the glowing skyline of the financial district. 45 minutes later, I pulled into an ultra-secure, private underground parking garage. I bypassed the main lobby entirely, stepping into a biometric, private elevator. The retinal scanner confirmed my identity with a soft, mechanical chime. As the elevator doors slid shut on the 62nd floor, my 2,800 square foot penthouse embraced me in quiet solitude. The countdown to their total destruction had officially begun. The morning sun hit the floor-to-ceiling glass of my living room, illuminating the Manhattan skyline and the dual monitors of my command center. I stood on the imported Brazilian walnut flooring, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, letting the bitter heat ground me in the immediate reality of Wednesday morning. The violent winter rainstorm from the previous evening had completely washed the city streets clean, leaving behind a crisp, unforgiving blue sky that stretched endlessly over the financial district. I set my ceramic mug down on the edge of my obsidian glass desk, the quiet click echoing across the vast, 2,800 square foot space. I tapped my mechanical keyboard twice, waking the sleeping screens from their digital slumber. The left monitor flared to life, casting a pale blue light across my face. It instantly loaded the primary encrypted financial dashboard for Aegis Health Networks, the corporate entity I had built entirely from scratch. I scrolled slowly past the daily operating metrics, my eyes locking onto the primary shareholder equity field. The green digital text read exactly $68,400,000 just 12 hours prior. My father had stood at the head of his opulent dining table and confidently labeled me a parasite. My mother, Sylvia, regularly spent her afternoons at her exclusive country club, actively curating a fictional narrative where I was a tragic, unstable daughter she valiantly tried to save. She told her wealthy peers that I was destitute, sleeping on a stained mattress in a damp basement apartment, too prideful to accept their generous charity. They genuinely believed their coordinated verbal abuse was successfully crushing my spirit. They did not understand that I wore their insults like a tailored suit of armor. My faded gray sweaters and quiet demeanor provided the perfect camouflage, allowing me to move completely undetected through the very financial and medical systems they worshipped. I shifted my gaze to the right monitor. Complex supply chain routing algorithms cascaded down the screen, tracking massive medical shipments across the eastern seaboard. Watching the data stream flow flawlessly triggered a visceral memory of my third year of medical school. I had not dropped out because the surgical curriculum was too demanding or the residency hours too exhausting. I walked away because I opened a restricted supply closet in the cardiovascular wing and found blood on the ledger. 3 years ago, I discovered that the hospital administration was actively routing substandard, counterfeit surgical supplies, specifically surgical mesh and defective arterial stents, into the operating rooms simply to cut overhead costs. I brought the glaring inventory discrepancies to my attending physicians, fully expecting righteous outrage. Instead, I received a cold, sharp warning to mind my own business. The senior surgeons, including men my father regularly invited to his lavish dinner parties, were receiving massive kickbacks from the corrupt distributors. Patients were experiencing severe, unexplained post-operative infections, and the administration was actively burying the data. I refused to hold a scalpel in a compromised operating room, so I walked out. I traded my heavy medical textbooks for advanced courses in data architecture and cryptographic security. I taught myself how to code, working 20 hours a day in total isolation, channeling my disgust into building a tangible solution. I founded Aegis Health Networks to digitize and forensically audit medical supply chains, creating an unalterable digital ledger that made procurement fraud mathematically impossible to hide. While my family spent the last 36 months sneering at my supposed unemployment, I was quietly securing $85 million in federal government compliance contracts. I did not just build a software company. I built the exact digital infrastructure that currently regulated the entire state's medical procurement network. The dramatic irony hung heavily in the quiet penthouse air. My father spent his days boasting about his elite surgical prowess, completely oblivious to the fact that the proprietary software running his operating room schedules, verifying the sterility of his surgical instruments, and managing his sensitive patient logistics belonged exclusively to me. Aegis Health Networks audited the very hospital system he treated like his personal, untouchable kingdom. I was the invisible architect of his daily reality. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow sip as I opened a heavily encrypted corporate dossier resting on the center of my desk. The file pertained directly to Elite Care, the highly exclusive concierge medical clinic my father and brother were currently attempting to launch. They envisioned a marble-lined sanctuary for ultra-wealthy politicians and corporate executives, a facility where standard medical wait times did not apply if the patient's check was large enough. But building a palace requires massive capital. The dossier contained the raw, unfiltered data of their initial financing. Everett had secured $40 million in aggressive commercial loans to lease the premium real estate and purchase high-end diagnostic equipment. However, the lending covenants embedded in those loans were incredibly predatory. The institutional bank required Elite Care to secure a top-tier, verifiable medical logistics software partnership before they would release the final operational permits. Without that specific software integration, the clinic could not legally open its doors or process a single patient. I scrolled through the debt structuring, analyzing the incredible financial leverage my father had recklessly accepted. If he missed his opening deadline by even a single week, the commercial bridge loans would instantly default. The resulting catastrophic penalty would cross-collateralize against his personal suburban estate and Grayson's trust accounts. My father had staked his home, his medical license, and his entire generational legacy on this single vanity project. I pulled up a secondary file, analyzing Grayson's preliminary supply requests for the new clinic, even in the planning stages. My older brother's staggering arrogance bled through the digital spreadsheets. He was actively attempting to order unnecessary, heavily marked up neurosurgical equipment from unverified vendors, demonstrating the exact same reckless incompetence that had resulted in his buried malpractice claims. He truly believed his last name granted him absolute immunity from consequence. The institutional lenders funding Elite Care had explicitly required them to use industry-standard logistics software. They were demanding my company. Everett and Grayson were currently scrambling to secure a meeting with the anonymous chief executive officer of Aegis, entirely unaware that the person they had just publicly evicted and screamed at in the freezing rain was the exact person holding the keys to their financial survival. I watched the cursor blink steadily against the pale blue screen, feeling absolutely no anger toward the men who had humiliated me. I closed the financial dossier with a sharp click, knowing my father was blindly building a glass castle directly on top of my active fault line. The Bellamy family did not practice medicine to heal the sick, they practiced medicine to govern the elite. For my father, a stethoscope was merely a prop, and a surgical theater was a stage designed to reinforce his absolute superiority. He viewed the general public's ailments as mundane, tedious distractions beneath his considerable talents. His true passion lay in treating the select few who held power: senators, hedge fund managers, and real estate moguls. Elite Care was the ultimate manifestation of this obsession. It was not designed as a hospital. It was engineered as a fortress of concierge medicine. The blueprints I had intercepted through the Aegis network detailed private subterranean entrances, recovery suites modeled after five-star hotel penthouses, and imported Italian marble lining the diagnostic corridors. Everett and my mother, Sylvia, envisioned a facility where ultra-wealthy politicians and executives paid staggering six-figure annual retainer fees simply for the privilege of bypassing standard waiting rooms and mingling with their own kind. Sylvia was completely consumed by the aesthetics and the social leverage of the project. She spent her days aggressively negotiating with interior decorators, selecting the exact shade of brushed brass for the lobby fixtures, treating the clinic like an exclusive country club rather than a medical necessity. She actively curated the family's public image to match this impending launch, carefully polishing the Bellamy name to a blinding shine. She hosted luncheons where she distributed glossy, heavy cardstock brochures to her wealthy friends, boasting about the unparalleled elite care her husband was bringing to the city. The most fragile piece of their meticulously crafted puzzle was my older brother, Grayson. Everett had boldly appointed him as Elite Care's chief of neurosurgery. It was a laughable, terrifying title for a 31-year-old resident who still struggled with basic procedural independence. Grayson possessed the arrogant swagger of a seasoned veteran, regularly berating nurses and dismissing the concerns of junior staff. But his actual surgical record was a minefield of catastrophic errors. I remembered the hushed, panicked phone calls echoing through our suburban estate 2 years ago, late at night. Grayson had severed a critical nerve during a routine spinal fusion, leaving a patient with permanent motor deficits. He did not face a medical review board. Instead, Everett leveraged his massive influence at the hospital, intimidating the attending physicians and quietly transferring a staggering sum of money, $2,500,000 from his personal accounts to secure an ironclad, non-disclosure agreement. Grayson's incompetence was buried under layers of legal threats and stolen credit. While he continued to strut through the hospital corridors wearing his heavy gold watch, entirely shielded from consequence. My encrypted smartphone vibrated sharply against the obsidian glass of my desk, pulling my focus away from the monitors. I picked up the heavy device. The screen displayed a new message from Sylvia. She never called. She preferred the documented control of text messages, where she could carefully craft her passive-aggressive venom without the risk of an unscripted argument. I swiped the screen open. The message was lengthy, typed with meticulous, punishing grammar. After your disgraceful display at the dinner table last night, your father and I are completely exhausted. We are dealing with highly sensitive investors this week for the clinic. Grayson is under immense pressure preparing to assume his role as chief of neurosurgery. He is doing the real, grueling work required to elevate this family. Do not contact him. Do not distract him with your instability. We need him focused on his genius, not dragged down by your continuous failures. Stay away until you are ready to apologize for walking out on us. I read the words twice, letting the sheer malice of her instructions wash over me. She was still actively pretending that I was the one who had thrown a tantrum, rewriting the narrative of my eviction to paint me as the aggressor. She demanded I stay away to protect Grayson's fragile genius, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had not spoken to my brother voluntarily in over 3 years. She wanted to ensure I remained isolated, punished for my perceived mediocrity, while she celebrated her golden child. I did not type a response. I did not attempt to defend myself or point out the blatant hypocrisy of her demands. Engaging with Sylvia's delusions only provided her with the oxygen she craved. I simply pressed the power button, plunging the phone screen into blackness, and placed it face down on the far corner of my desk. I turned my attention entirely back to the dual monitors of my command center. I pulled my mechanical keyboard closer, my fingers striking the keys with a rapid, rhythmic cadence. I logged out of my primary Aegis administrative dashboard and opened a secure, restricted terminal. Through the network of federal compliance audits my company managed, I possessed direct, backdoor access to the preliminary supply chain requisitions for Elite Care. Since the clinic was desperately trying to secure its final operational permits, they were required to submit their anticipated surgical inventory and billing structures to the state regulatory boards. I accessed Grayson's specific departmental files, the neurosurgery requisition logs populated on my right monitor, scrolling endlessly in neat digital rows. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense alphanumeric codes. Aegis's proprietary algorithms were designed to flag procurement irregularities, and the system was currently highlighting multiple lines of Grayson's data in glaring red text. It took exactly 4 minutes for the true depth of the anomalies to surface. Grayson was not just incompetent in the operating room, he was remarkably arrogant in his administrative duties. I highlighted a sequence of equipment orders tied to his preliminary surgical schedule. He was logging requisitions for highly specialized, single-use titanium cervical plates at 5 times the standard market rate. He was routing the massive purchases through a newly formed, unverified medical supply distributor registered to a vacant address in Delaware. The corporate structure was a textbook kickback scheme, designed to siphon funds directly from the clinic's operating budget into untraceable offshore accounts. But he did not stop at inflated equipment costs. I cross-referenced his projected procedural billing codes against the federal guidelines. Grayson was actively preloading the clinic's software with diagnostic codes that triggered automatic maximum payout Medicare reimbursements for non-existent post-operative therapies. He was establishing a framework to bill federal healthcare programs for phantom services, padding Elite Care's anticipated revenue to appease their institutional lenders. He assumed that because the clinic catered to the ultra-wealthy, federal regulators would simply overlook the automated billing submissions. He was committing documented federal wire fraud and systemic Medicare billing fraud before the clinic had even opened its mahogany doors. I felt a cold, sharp focus settle deep in my chest. I opened a new, heavily encrypted folder on my secure local drive. I named the digital vault simply with Grayson's initials. I did not rush. I methodically began extracting the damning data packets, transferring the requisition logs, the fraudulent billing structures, and the digital signatures linking the Delaware shell company directly to Grayson's personal administrative credentials. Every file I dragged into the vault was another nail in his professional coffin. I secured the folder with a complex cryptographic key, locking the undeniable proof of his felonies safely behind impenetrable digital walls. My family believed they were untouchable masters of the universe, hovering high above the consequences that governed ordinary people. They thought my silence was submission, a pathetic acceptance of my status as the family disappointment. They spent their days curating a flawless aristocratic illusion, completely unaware that I was already inspecting the rotting wooden beams holding up their stage. Arrogance is incredibly expensive, and Everett was funding his vanity with borrowed time and stolen capital. Aegis's industry-wide data streams provided a flawless, unobstructed window into the hemorrhaging accounts of Elite Care. On my left monitor, the commercial loan ledgers updated in real time, pulling raw data from the Federal Registry. My father had initially secured $40 million from a prominent institutional bank. Now, I watched him aggressively execute a secondary draw, pulling another $10 million from a highly predatory shadow lender. The terms of this secondary mezzanine debt were absolutely lethal. The interest rates were astronomical, carrying a staggering 19% annual yield, and the contract included aggressive default covenants that completely bypassed standard grace periods. He was not using the newly injected capital to purchase advanced diagnostic machines or to secure top-tier nursing staff. He was burning through the cash to fund the superficial aesthetics of his medical palace. I tracked the outbound wire transfers executing across his accounts. $150,000 routed to an Italian importer for rare Calicut marble flooring, $85,000 wired directly to a boutique lighting firm in Paris for custom crystal chandeliers designed to hang in the recovery suites, $32,000 authorized for mahogany wall paneling in his private executive office. He was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate, desperate to construct a physical environment that validated his manufactured superiority. But the institutional lenders underwriting this disaster were not entirely foolish. The covenants embedded in his primary loan required Everett to demonstrate long-term operational sustainability before they would disperse the final operational funds, to appease the bank executives and satisfy the loan conditions. My father submitted a formal declaration. He claimed he was in the final stages of securing a proprietary logistics partnership. He promised the lenders this advanced software integration would automate complex billing, eliminate supply chain waste, and guarantee incredibly low overhead for the lifetime of the clinic. He presented this impending partnership as the absolute anchor of Elite Care's financial viability. I opened the vendor application file he had submitted to the bank. A cold, quiet smile touched the corners of my mouth. The elite logistics firm Everett was so aggressively courting. The company he viewed as his absolute financial savior was Vanguard Medical Solutions. Vanguard Medical Solutions was a wholly owned, heavily shielded subsidiary of Aegis Health Networks. My father was practically begging my company for the exact software architecture he legally required to open his mahogany doors. I reached across my obsidian glass desk, picked up my encrypted phone, and opened a secure communication channel to my chief operating officer. I did not type a lengthy explanation. I simply instructed him to place the Vanguard partnership application for Elite Care under an indefinite, maximum-level compliance review. I ordered the board to stall the approval process entirely, demanding endless rounds of secondary documentation, redundant security audits, and irrelevant financial disclosures. We were going to starve him. Without the Vanguard software partnership, Everett could not satisfy the bank's stipulations. Without the bank's final disbursement, he could not secure his municipal health permits. Without the permits, he could not legally process a single patient or collect a single dollar of revenue. The clock on his $50 million of toxic debt was ticking relentlessly, and I had just completely frozen the gears of his survival. The sudden sharp ringing of my personal cell phone broke the quiet hum of the servers. I glanced at the glowing screen resting on my desk. The caller identification displayed a number from a rural area code in upstate New York. It was Uncle Thomas. Thomas was my father's older brother, though they shared absolutely nothing but a last name. While Everett chased elite politicians and obsessed over luxury real estate, Thomas operated a modest 3-room family practice in a blue-collar farming community. He drove a 10-year-old truck, regularly accepted homemade baked goods or carpentry work as payment when his patients could not afford their copays, and treated medicine as a genuine, quiet act of service. He was the only member of the Bellamy family who had ever looked at me with pride instead of expectation. I swiped the green acceptance icon and pressed the phone to my ear. "Quinn," Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp carrying a heavy weight of exhaustion. "Hello, Uncle Thomas," I replied, softening my posture and my tone. "I heard about the anniversary dinner," he continued, a deep sigh rattling through the speaker. "Your mother called me this morning. She spent 45 minutes on the phone." I kept my gaze locked on the scrolling financial data, my spine stiffening. "What did Sylvia tell you?" "She claimed you lost your mind at the table," Thomas murmured, the skepticism thick and heavy in his voice. "She said you were completely destitute, that you walked out into the freezing rain because you were too proud to ask for help. She told me you are living in a damp basement, starving, and refusing to answer anyone's calls. The sheer depth of Sylvia's malice was breathtaking. She was actively reaching out to extended relatives, weaving a pathetic, fabricated narrative to ensure my total social isolation. She was preemptively destroying my credibility just in case I ever tried to expose their cruelty. She wanted everyone to view me as a tragic, broken failure. I am not starving. Uncle Thomas, I stated quietly, keeping my breathing perfectly even. I know you are not crazy, kid, Thomas replied, the gentle warmth returning to his tone. But I also know Everett. I know how heavy his hand can be. I know how much it costs to live in the city without a safety net. The line went silent for a few seconds. I heard the faint rustle of paper on his end, likely patient charts resting on his worn wooden desk. I have $2,500 sitting in a savings account, Thomas offered, his voice dropping to a private, urgent whisper. It is not a fortune, but it is enough to keep the heat on and buy groceries for a few months. I can wire it to you this afternoon. You do not have to pay me back. Quinn, just let me help you. A sudden sharp tightness gripped my chest. While my father was burning through $50 million of stolen capital to buy imported chandeliers, Thomas was offering me his meager personal savings because he genuinely believed I was freezing in the dark. He was willing to empty a safety net for a niece the rest of the family had discarded like trash. I closed my eyes, pressing the pads of my fingers firmly against the cool glass of my desk. I desperately wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to tell him about Aegis Health Networks, about the $68,400,000 sitting in my primary accounts, about the penthouse currently overlooking the Manhattan skyline. But the tactical perimeter was not fully secured, and involving him now would only expose his modest practice to Everett's inevitable, vicious fallout. Uncle Thomas, I said, my voice steady but infused with profound gratitude. Thank you, truly, but I cannot take your money. Quinn, please do not let pride get in the way of survival, he urged, genuine worry tightening his syllables. It is not pride, I reassured him. Opening my eyes and looking at the red deficit numbers bleeding across my father's ledger. I am safe. I have a roof over my head, and I have plenty to eat. I am exactly where I need to be right now. Thomas let out another long sigh, the tension easing slightly from his breathing. All right, kid, but the offer stands. You call me the exact second you need anything. You are not alone out there. I know. Take care of yourself. Uncle Thomas? I disconnected the call with Uncle Thomas, my jaw locking into stone as I watched my father frantically double down on a losing hand. The digital silence of my penthouse was shattered by a relentless knocking on the heavy oak doors of my corporate office downtown. I had relocated my operations later that afternoon, trading the solitary altitude of my residential high-rise for the fortified, glass-walled executive suite of Aegis Health Networks. My chief legal officer stood in the doorway, rapping his knuckles against the thick mahogany to pull me from my intense focus. He handed me a physical brief detailing the escalating panic within the elite care financial structure, nodded silently, and left me to my work. The sheer volume of their toxic debt was suffocating, and the pressure was clearly forcing my father to hunt for liquid capital in every forgotten corner of our family history. After reviewing the finalized software embargo, the sterile, highly regulated environment of my corporate headquarters felt too confining. I needed a temporary change of scenery. I left the imposing glass fortress of Aegis and walked 2 blocks through the biting wind to a quiet, independent espresso bar tucked into a narrow brick alleyway. The establishment was a sanctuary of exposed brick, worn leather chairs, and the rich, heavy scent of roasted coffee beans. I sat at a small, secluded table in the far corner, wearing the exact same faded gray sweater I had worn to the anniversary dinner. I rested my calloused hands around a warm ceramic mug, watching the city traffic crawl past the rain-streaked window panes, enjoying a rare moment of stillness. The brass bell above the heavy glass door chimed violently. The cold wind rushed into the warm cafe, instantly altering the atmospheric pressure of the room. I did not need to turn my head to know who had walked in. The heavy, suffocating scent of my mother's expensive floral perfume completely overpowered the earthy aroma of the roasted espresso. Sylvia and Grayson stepped into the quiet cafe, looking entirely alien and deeply offended by their surroundings. Sylvia wore a pristine white cashmere coat and a heavy pearl necklace, clutching her designer handbag against her chest as if the ambient air of a working-class coffee shop might contaminate her. Grayson flanked her, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, his heavy gold luxury watch gleaming under the low, industrial pendant lights. They had not stumbled upon me by accident. Sylvia must have hired a private investigator to track my daily movements, desperate to corner me in public after I deliberately ignored her passive-aggressive text messages. Sylvia marched directly toward my corner table. She did not offer a greeting. She pulled the metal chair opposite me outward, the metal legs scraping with a harsh, grating screech against the polished concrete floor. She sat down, her posture rigidly straight, looking at my faded sweater with a deeply ingrained expression of unvarnished disgust. Grayson remained standing just behind her right shoulder, looming like a tailored shadow, crossing his arms over his broad chest in a blatant attempt to establish physical dominance. Sylvia unclasped her designer handbag with a sharp snap. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. She withdrew a dense stack of premium legal paper and slid it aggressively across the reclaimed wood table. "You are going to sign this today, Quinn," Sylvia demanded, her voice a low, venomous hiss designed to carry just far enough to reach my ears without drawing the attention of the surrounding patrons. I did not reach for the paper. I simply lowered my eyes, scanning the bold text printed across the top of the first page. It was a formal relinquishment of beneficiary rights. I looked at the principal amount listed in the secondary clause, $200,000. It was the exact balance of an irrevocable trust fund established by my late grandmother before she passed away. She was the only person in the Bellamy family who saw through my father's glittering facade. She recognized the toxic, controlling nature of his financial leverage. To protect me, she meticulously insulated that specific account from Everett's control, structuring the trust so that it would mature and transfer entirely into my name upon my 28th birthday. It was a modest safety net, intended to protect me from the very financial manipulation my family was currently attempting to execute, because Everett could not legally seize the funds. They needed my voluntary, legally binding signature to drain the account. Sylvia tapped her manicured fingernail, painted a severe, glossy red, directly against the blank signature line at the bottom of the page. "You have always been incredibly selfish," Sylvia continued, her upper lip curling into a sneer. "You are currently unemployed. You have completely disgraced this family, and you are wasting your life sitting in cheap coffee shops hiding from your failures. Grayson actually needs this capital. He is doing the real, grueling work required to elevate the Bellamy name. The Municipal Zoning Board requires a final liquidity deposit for his surgical permits by the end of the week. Your father's primary accounts are temporarily tied up in the larger facility investments, so you are going to transfer this trust to your brother immediately." The absolute staggering irony of her demand settled heavily in my chest. Elite Care was suffocating under $50 million of commercial debt. The shadow lenders were freezing their operational draws because I had personally orchestrated a compliance embargo on their required logistics software. My father's massive, gleaming medical palace was bleeding out, and the resulting panic had reduced my status-obsessed mother and arrogant brother to hunting down a $200,000 trust fund just to keep the lights on. They were completely desperate, scavenging for scraps to delay their inevitable bankruptcy. Grayson leaned forward, placing his large hands flat on the table. The heavy gold watch clinked sharply against the wood. The scent of stale liquor lingered beneath his expensive cologne, a clear indicator that the stress of the impending default was keeping him awake at night. "You owe us, Quinn," Grayson sneered, his voice laced with unearned superiority. "You embarrassed Dad in front of the entire family at the anniversary dinner. You walked out like a petulant, ungrateful child when he was simply trying to correct your path. Signing this over is the absolute bare minimum you can do to repay the damage you caused to our reputation." I did not yell. I did not defend my choices, nor did I explain that my personal accounts currently held more than $68 million. Engaging with their delusions only provided them with the oxygen they desperately craved. Instead, I calmly folded my hands together and rested them on the edge of the table. I looked up, bypassing the intimidating posture Grayson was attempting to project, and locked my gaze directly onto the faint, uncontrollable tremor rattling his fingers. I saw the dark, bruised exhaustion settling beneath his eyes. The pristine illusion of the golden child was fracturing under the crushing weight of his own profound incompetence. I looked back down at the predatory legal document with a slow, deliberate motion. I pushed the thick stack of paper back across the reclaimed wood, sliding it until it bumped gently against my mother's designer handbag. "I am not signing away my grandmother's trust to fund a failing clinic," I stated, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. Sylvia gasped, her jaw dropping open as her face flushed a mottled, furious red. She simply could not comprehend a reality where the family failure refused to submit to their demands. Grayson's arrogant facade violently shattered, his smirk twisted into an ugly, desperate snarl. He lunged forward and slammed his closed fist against the surface of the table. The sudden, violent impact rattled the heavy ceramic mug resting near my hands. A dark, boiling wave of hot espresso sloshed over the rim, pooling rapidly across the polished wood and soaking directly into the edge of their pristine legal document. I did not flinch at his outburst. I simply stood up, smoothing the hem of my faded gray sweater with absolute chilling composure. I looked down at the two highly educated, desperately bankrupt doctors scrambling to salvage a piece of ruined paper. "You will be begging us for a handout by the end of the month," Grayson shouted, frantically attempting to mask his raw, bleeding panic with a cruel, mocking laugh that sounded entirely hollow in the quiet cafe. I left the unsigned waiver resting in a puddle of spilled espresso, walking away as my brother's arrogant laughter echoed bitterly against the brick walls. Rejection was something the Bellamy patriarch simply could not tolerate, and his retaliation was swift and entirely performative. I walked the remaining 3 blocks back to my penthouse, the biting Manhattan wind acting as a sharp palate cleanser after the suffocating encounter in the coffee shop. By the time the biometric elevator doors slid open to my living room, my phone was already vibrating with a relentless, frantic rhythm against the silk lining of my coat pocket. Sylvia and Grayson had undoubtedly rushed straight to my father's executive office to report their failure. They had failed to extort the $200,000, meaning the crushing weight of their $50 million in commercial debt was still actively suffocating them. I set my coat on the back of a leather chair, walked to the kitchen island, and poured a glass of iced water. I picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. The notifications were cascading down the glass in a chaotic waterfall of digital panic. I opened the extended Bellamy family group chat, a massive digital thread containing 32 aunts, uncles, and cousins. I had kept the chat muted for 3 years, remaining a silent observer while they posted photos of luxury vacations and medical galas. Today, the chat was dominated by a massive, multi-paragraph message authored by Everett. I carried my glass of water to the command center, sat in my ergonomic chair, and mirrored my phone screen onto the right monitor, the text enlarged, displaying the sheer, unvarnished depth of his malice. "It breaks my heart to write this," my father's message began, heavily laden with manufactured grief. "As many of you witnessed at our 30th anniversary dinner, our youngest daughter, Quinn, is suffering from a severe, escalating mental health crisis. We have tried everything to get her the psychiatric help she so desperately needs, but her paranoia and instability have reached a dangerous peak." I took a slow sip of ice water, watching the cursor blink as I read the fabricated tragedy. "This afternoon," the message continued, "Sylvia and Grayson attempted to stage a quiet, loving intervention at a local cafe. They offered her a safe place to stay and a fully funded medical treatment plan. Instead of accepting our help, Quinn suffered a complete psychotic break. She became violently hysterical, screaming obscenities and throwing hot espresso at her mother and brother before fleeing into the street." He was flawlessly inverting reality. Grayson had slammed his fist onto the table in a blind panic over his impending bankruptcy, spilling the coffee himself. Yet Everett was actively twisting that exact moment to paint me as a deranged, violent aggressor and Grayson as a wounded savior. Immediately below my father's massive post, Sylvia had chimed in to solidify the victim narrative. "I am still shaking," my mother typed, appending a crying emoji to the text. "My pristine white cashmere coat is completely ruined, but the physical burns are nothing compared to the heartbreak of watching my own daughter lose her grip on reality. Grayson had to physically shield me from her violent outburst. I am issuing this warning as a protective father," Everett's final paragraph concluded. "Do not engage with her if she reaches out. Do not lend her a single dollar, as financial enablement will only fuel her delusions. We are officially cutting all contact for her own safety. Hoping hitting absolute rock bottom will force her into compliance. Please pray for our family during this agonizing chapter." I scrolled slowly down the thread. The responses from my extended relatives poured in with nauseating speed. Dozens of replies flooded the screen, packed with performative sympathy. My aunt wrote a lengthy paragraph praising Everett and Sylvia for their profound strength in the face of such a horrific tragedy. A cousin commented that it was a blessing Grayson was not permanently scarred by the boiling coffee. Another relative suggested blocking my number entirely to maintain the family's peace. They were feasting on the drama, elevating my father to the status of a tragic martyr burdened by a defective child. He was effectively leveraging my silence, ensuring that I was completely socially isolated and financially blacklisted from the entire family tree. He wanted to guarantee that when I inevitably failed, I would have absolutely no one to turn to, forcing me to crawl back to his sprawling suburban estate on my hands and knees to beg for his forgiveness. I did not type a single keystroke in my defense. I did not log onto Facebook or Instagram to post a frantic rebuttal, nor did I upload photos of Grayson's spilled coffee to prove my innocence. Fighting a smear campaign requires engaging with the premise that their opinions hold any value. When you step into the mud to wrestle a pig, you both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. I refused to grant my father the satisfaction of a defensive reaction. I simply absorbed the character assassination in utter, unbreakable silence. I closed the messaging application, silencing the notifications completely. I turned my chair away from the social media circus and faced my left monitor. I opened a heavily encrypted, direct communication channel to the chief legal officer at Aegis Health Networks. The digital perimeter required a multi-factor authentication, scanning my thumbprint against the edge of the keyboard before granting access to the secure corporate network. The chat window opened. I bypassed standard greetings. "I need a comprehensive, silent audit initiated immediately," I typed, the mechanical keys clicking with sharp, deliberate precision. "Target parameters," my legal officer replied within seconds, the text appearing instantly on the pale blue screen. "The primary institutional lender holding the commercial debt for Elite Care," I instructed. "Identify the exact banking syndicate that issued the initial $40 million draw. I want every single page of their debt covenants dissected. Map the exact cross-collateralization clauses, the grace period waivers, and the absolute deadlines for the software compliance integration." "Understood." The response flashed. "We are deploying the shadow compliance team now. We will map the institutional architecture without triggering a single external alert. What is the ultimate objective?" "I need to know the exact minute their operational permits expire due to our logistics software embargo," I typed, my eyes tracing the sharp angles of the Manhattan skyline outside my window. "I need to understand the exact mechanism that triggers a catastrophic default. Specifically, isolate any clauses linking the clinic's failure to Everett's suburban estate or Grayson's personal assets. Do not leave a single digital fingerprint. The financial guillotine will be fully mapped by tomorrow morning," my legal officer confirmed, signing off the secure channel. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the quiet hum of the servers wash over the spacious penthouse. My father was currently sitting in his mahogany-paneled study, basking in the warm glow of his family's fabricated sympathy. He felt incredibly powerful, successfully excommunicating a daughter who refused to surrender a $200,000 trust fund. He genuinely believed his manipulative text message was a lethal strike, a masterclass in social dominance that would bring me to my knees. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy weaponizing emojis and group chats, I was weaponizing his massive commercial lenders directly against him. Social isolation was a pathetic, toothless threat against a woman who actively preferred the quiet. I did not need invitations to their catered holiday dinners, and I certainly did not need their conditional, transactional love. I possessed a $68,400,000 fortress, and I was preparing to dismantle his entire universe, brick by brick. Let them feast on the fabricated gossip today, because tomorrow I was going to starve them of every single dollar they possessed. Desperation fundamentally alters a man's vision, making him entirely blind to the traps sitting plainly in his path. The morning after my father's fabricated social media circus, my chief legal officer delivered the comprehensive audit of Elite Care's financial architecture. I sat at my obsidian glass desk, the bright Manhattan sunlight washing over my dual monitors as I dissected the exact parameters of my family's impending doom. The institutional banking syndicate held a $50 million guillotine directly over my father's neck. The launch date for his marble-lined medical fortress was exactly 3 weeks away, and the audit revealed a catastrophic vulnerability. The commercial lenders had completely frozen the final $15 million operational disbursement. Without that massive influx of cash, Everett could not pay his specialized contractors, could not finalize his municipal health department inspections, and could not legally open the heavy mahogany doors of his clinic. The bank's condition for releasing the frozen funds was absolute and non-negotiable. Elite Care had to secure the Vanguard Medical Solutions logistics partnership. Without my proprietary software actively managing their supply chain and compliance protocols, the entire $50 million loan would instantly default. The software embargo I had initiated 2 days prior was actively suffocating them, and the resulting panic began to manifest directly on my screens. My inbox, routed through the highly secure, anonymous executive portal of Aegis Health Networks, began to flood with incoming communications from Elite Care's administrative servers. Everett did not possess my direct corporate email address. He was submitting urgent inquiries through our automated partnership portal, frantically trying to bypass the administrative holds my board had placed on his application. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, keeping my hands perfectly still in my lap, and traced the rapid progression of my father's psychological collapse through his digital footprint. The first email arrived at exactly 9 in the morning. It was formal, brief, and carried the standard, arrogant tone he used when addressing hospital staff, demanding a timeline update on his pending software integration. The second message arrived at 2 in the afternoon, heavily marked with high-priority red flags, requesting an immediate phone consultation. By the time the sun set over the financial district, casting long, dark shadows across my penthouse floor, his messages had completely devolved into a frantic, groveling stream of consciousness. I opened a message time-stamped at 3 in the morning. Everett was writing directly to the anonymous founder and chief executive officer. I leaned closer to the pale blue monitor, reading the exact words my father had typed in the dead of night while his $50 million vanity project burned to the ground around him. Your visionary approach to medical logistics is entirely unparalleled in this industry, Everett wrote, his digital tone dripping with a fawning, pathetic reverence that made my skin crawl. We at Elite Care recognize the absolute brilliance of your software architecture. It would be our profound honor to integrate your genius into our facility. We consider Vanguard the absolute gold standard, and we are willing to do whatever it takes to finalize this integration. The heavy, suffocating irony settled over my command center like a thick fog. Just 24 hours ago, this exact same man had typed a massive group chat message calling me a deranged, hysterical parasite. He had publicly thrown me into the freezing rain at his anniversary dinner, mocked my data career as a glorified secretarial joke, and actively demanded our extended family cut all ties with me to ensure my starvation. Now. He was sitting in his mahogany-paneled study in the middle of the night, bleeding capital, unknowingly writing desperate love letters to the very daughter he had just completely discarded. Grayson's administrative credentials were copied on the subsequent correspondence. The golden child, who had slammed his fist onto a coffee shop table and demanded I surrender my $200,000 inheritance to save his skin, added his own pathetic pleas to the email chain. "We are prepared to bypass all standard negotiation phases," Grayson typed, the sheer terror of his impending bankruptcy completely overriding any semblance of basic corporate strategy. "We recognize the premium, exclusive value of Vanguard Medical Solutions and are willing to accommodate any structural or financial demands your board requires to expedite this partnership today." The following morning, the ultimate surrender arrived in my encrypted inbox. Everett was completely cornered by his institutional lenders. His commercial bankers had officially issued a 3-week notice of default if the logistics contract was not signed by the night of his glittering launch gala. They would seize the clinic and liquidate the assets. Driven by absolute, unadulterated panic, Everett offered a staggering, utterly absurd set of financial concessions just to get my anonymous signature on a piece of paper. He offered to completely waive all standard implementation grace periods. He offered a massive, unprecedented increase in the software licensing fees, padding Aegis's profit sharing to an astronomical degree that would effectively bleed his own clinic dry within a year. But the final paragraph of his long, rambling email contained the lethal trap I had been patiently waiting for. Everett and Grayson were completely out of liquid capital to secure the exorbitant new financial terms they were desperately offering. They needed to provide secondary financial backing to satisfy my corporate board's risk assessment. "As a gesture of our absolute commitment to this partnership and to assure you of our long-term financial viability," Everett wrote, his blinding arrogance masking the lethal danger of his own words, "my son and I are prepared to pledge our personal assets as a guarantee against the Vanguard licensing agreements. We will legally cross-collateralize the software contract against our primary suburban estate, our luxury vehicles, and all active family trust accounts." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I read the sentence 3 times, my eyes scanning the crisp, black text on the glowing screen. They were voluntarily handing me the exact financial chains required to bind them permanently to the sinking ship in their frantic, sweaty scramble to appease their commercial lenders and launch their marble-lined clinic. They were offering the very suburban estate from which I had been publicly evicted as collateral. I picked up my encrypted phone and opened the secure channel to my chief legal officer. I did not hesitate. "Draft the Vanguard Medical Solutions Partnership Agreement immediately," I instructed, my voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet penthouse. "Accept every single one of their absurd financial concessions. Lock in the inflated licensing fees." I paused, looking past my monitors at the sprawling, untouchable city below. "And cement the cross-collateralization clauses," I commanded, my jaw locking tight. "I want the exact deeds to the suburban estate and the routing numbers for Grayson's personal trusts explicitly listed in the default penalties. Ensure the language is absolutely ironclad. If Elite Care fails a single compliance audit or breaches standard medical regulations, I want the explicit legal authority to instantly seize every single asset they just offered. Bury the triggers deep in the compliance addendums." My legal officer confirmed the directive instantly. The contract would be a masterpiece of lethal corporate jargon. My father and brother, in their panicked rush to secure their bank funding before the 3-week deadline, would blindly sign the paperwork without properly vetting the catastrophic compliance triggers. They were so deeply obsessed with maintaining their illusion of prestige that they refused to acknowledge the fundamental mechanics of the business they were attempting to run. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitor. Everett had requested an immediate digital signature to forward to his bank. That was too quiet. That was far too private. A sterile digital signature sent through an encrypted portal would not deliver the public undeniable devastation they had so ruthlessly earned. I opened the reply window, typing my response through the anonymous executive portal. I informed them that Vanguard Medical Solutions accepted their financial terms. I agreed to provide the logistical software required to unlock their $50 million bank loans. However, I stipulated one absolute, non-negotiable condition. The partnership contract would not be executed via a digital portal or hidden in a back office. It required a physical, in-person signature from the founder of the company to guarantee the unprecedented terms they had offered. The founder would attend their event in exactly 3 weeks to finalize the agreement. I drafted the corporate response, officially inviting them to sign their own financial death warrants at their precious launch gala. A golden child rarely understands the concept of consequence, assuming the world will simply bend to accommodate his incompetence. For his entire life, Grayson had been insulated from the devastating results of his own reckless actions. When he failed his preliminary medical board examinations, my father leveraged his immense professional network to secure Grayson a private, highly questionable reassessment. When Grayson severed a critical nerve during a routine spinal fusion, Everett quietly transferred $2,500,000 to bury the malpractice lawsuit under layers of ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Grayson never faced a disciplinary committee. He never sat in a courtroom. He simply adjusted the heavy gold watch on his wrist and continued walking the hospital corridors, genuinely believing his last name granted him absolute immunity from the laws that governed ordinary people. That deeply ingrained arrogance ultimately drove him to make a catastrophic, unforced error exactly 2 weeks before the Elite Care launch gala. My father had successfully secured the Vanguard Medical Solutions Partnership Agreement on paper, pending my in-person signature at the event. However, the institutional bankers holding the $50 million commercial debt were not entirely satisfied with a mere promise. The compliance auditors representing the lending syndicate demanded a preliminary demonstration of the clinic's operational readiness. They required Grayson, the newly appointed chief of neurosurgery, to present a live, functional mock-up of the surgical logistics and supply chain framework to prove the clinic could effectively manage patient intake on day 1. Grayson panicked. He did not possess the technical competence to construct a simulated logistical model, and he certainly could not wait 2 weeks for the official Vanguard onboarding process. His fragile ego refused to allow him to admit his limitations to the banking auditors, and his absolute terror of the impending loan default pushed him to seek a desperate, illegal shortcut. He decided to pirate the system. I was sitting in my Penthouse command center on a quiet Thursday evening, sipping a glass of iced water and reviewing the finalized cross-collateralization contracts my legal team had drafted. The sprawling Manhattan skyline outside my floor-to-ceiling windows was obscured by a thick, rolling winter fog. The only light in the expansive living room came from the steady, pale blue glow of my dual monitors. Suddenly, the ambient lighting in my workspace violently shifted. The right monitor flashed a harsh, strobing red. A high-pitched, rhythmic mechanical chime echoed from the primary server tower mounted beneath my obsidian glass desk. It was an Aegis Tier 1 federal security alert. I set my glass of water down, the condensation leaving a perfectly round ring on the glass surface. I pulled my mechanical keyboard forward, my fingers striking the keys with rapid, clinical precision. I bypassed the automated defense protocols to manually intercept the incoming threat. Aegis Health Networks managed the heavily encrypted, heavily regulated supply chain data for thousands of federal and private medical facilities. A Tier 1 alert indicated a direct, brute force breach attempt on our restricted compliance servers. I isolated the incoming data packets, stripping away the crude layers of digital camouflage the intruder had attempted to erect. The digital forensic tracking took exactly 45 seconds. I traced the unauthorized ping back to a static internet protocol address. The address resolved directly to the executive administrative offices of Elite Care. I dug deeper, isolating the specific media access control address of the hardware attempting the breach. It matched the precise administrative laptop registered to Grayson's active medical profile. I kept my breathing perfectly even, watching my older brother blindly smash his way into a digital fortress. He was attempting to bypass the encrypted Vanguard handshake protocols using an unauthorized, open-source beta script he had clearly purchased from a shadow developer online. He was trying to spoof a connection to my servers to generate a fake, functional logistics dashboard to present to the institutional bankers the following morning. But generating a functional logistics dashboard requires raw data. A supply chain algorithm cannot simulate surgical equipment requisitions or diagnostic billing codes without patient profiles to process. I watched the red alerts continue to multiply across my screen as Grayson made his fatal, irreversible mistake. To make his fraudulent demonstration look entirely authentic to the bank's seasoned compliance auditors, Grayson did not use fabricated, randomized test profiles. He uploaded an actual, localized database of patient records. He took a massive digital file he had illegally scraped from his previous residency hospital, a list containing over 800 real names, dates of birth, social security numbers, and highly sensitive neurological diagnostic histories, and fed it directly into the pirated, unencrypted beta script. He was actively transmitting protected health information across state lines using unsecured, fraudulent third-party software to spoof a connection to a federal contractor. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, the harsh red light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity was breathtaking. Grayson thought he was simply cutting a clever corner to appease a group of impatient bankers. He did not realize that by uploading that specific file, he had just committed severe, documented felony offenses. The transmission of unencrypted medical data constituted a massive, catastrophic violation of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Furthermore, because he was executing the transfer across state servers to artificially inflate the operational readiness of his clinic for the purpose of securing commercial loan disbursements, he was actively committing federal wire fraud. Because he was executing these crimes using the primary administrative network of Elite Care, he had instantly poisoned the entire clinic's compliance standing. He had essentially tied a federal anchor directly to his father's $50 million vanity project. I did not initiate an immediate block on his IP address. I did not shut down the server to protect him from his own incompetence. When an arrogant predator is actively digging his own grave, you do not take the shovel out of his hands. You simply step back and watch the dirt pile up. I allowed his upload to continue. I opened a secondary diagnostic window on my left monitor, meticulously capturing every single digital packet he transmitted. I isolated the exact keystrokes, the timestamps, and the unique digital signature linking the upload directly to his administrative credentials. I recorded the unencrypted patient data flowing through the compromised script, ensuring the chain of custody for the digital evidence was absolutely flawless. I watched the progress bar on his upload slowly reach 100%. The red security alerts on my screen ceased their frantic strobing, locking into a solid, glaring crimson block that indicated the breach attempt had concluded. Grayson had successfully populated his fake dashboard. He was undoubtedly sitting in his mahogany-paneled office right now, leaning back in his chair with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, entirely convinced of his own unmatched brilliance. I placed my hands flat against the cool glass of my desk. I opened a new, highly restricted digital vault on my local drive. I initiated a direct download of the raw server logs, extracting the undeniable, hard-coded proof of his multiple federal felonies. The mechanical click of my mouse was the only sound in the quiet penthouse as I dragged the massive data files into the secure folder. I selected the compiled logs, the decrypted patient lists, and the network timestamps. I compressed the files into a single, encrypted presentation folder. I did not need to sift through thousands of pages of circumstantial evidence to destroy his career. I possessed the absolute, mathematical proof of his guilt, packaged neatly into a digital file that required zero interpretation. I locked the presentation folder with a specialized cryptographic key, adding it to the growing arsenal of destruction I had prepared for the launch gala. Grayson thought he was cutting a clever corner, entirely oblivious that he had just handed me the federal guillotine required to sever his medical license permanently. The 5-week mark loomed over the city like a suffocating thundercloud, and the atmospheric pressure inside the Elite Care boardroom was reaching a critical mass. The week of the launch gala had officially arrived. Through my encrypted corporate intelligence feeds, I monitored the frantic digital footprint of my father's final scramble. The institutional banking syndicate holding his $50 million commercial debt had grown remarkably impatient. Grayson's pirated beta demonstration had temporarily stalled the compliance auditors, But the senior loan officers were not easily pacified by digital smoke and mirrors. They recognized the glaring operational voids. They issued a strict non-negotiable ultimatum, delivered via a certified legal notice directly to Everett's primary office. If the chief executive officer of Aegis Health Networks did not physically appear at the launch gala and sign the logistics partnership live on stage, the standard grace period would instantly vanish. The massive commercial loans would enter immediate, catastrophic default. The bank explicitly threatened to seize the half-finished clinic, halting all construction crews and locking the mahogany doors before a single patient ever crossed the threshold. To appease the ruthless lenders and prevent a total foreclosure, Everett resorted to a breathtaking, desperate lie. He formally assured the banking syndicate that the anonymous founder of Aegis was a close personal friend. He promised the executives that the partnership was an absolute certainty, a done deal secured by decades of mutual professional respect. He staked his entire professional reputation on a fictional relationship with a phantom, completely unaware that his beloved friend was the exact daughter he had violently banished into the freezing rain exactly 35 days prior. While Everett peddled fabricated friendships to skeptical bankers, Sylvia descended into a manic, micromanaging frenzy. The sheer terror of their impending bankruptcy drove my mother to aggressively overcompensate, attempting to project an illusion of infinite, untouchable wealth. I watched the final. Desperate transactions bleed across the intercepted ledger. She was actively draining the last remaining dregs of their liquid capital to fund the gala's superficial aesthetics. She authorized an $85,000 wire transfer for thousands of rare, imported white orchids to drape across the entrance columns of the Plaza Hotel. She routed another $45,000 payment to a premium catering syndicate, demanding a menu featuring white truffles and beluga caviar to ensure the city's political elite felt adequately pampered. Her vanity knew absolutely no limits. She spent hours pacing the hardwood floors of her suburban estate, loudly berating event coordinators over her cell phone regarding the exact shade of the silk table runners. She treated the hired staff with her signature brand of sharp, dismissive venom, masking her internal panic with external cruelty. She even authorized a temporary, heavily insured rental agreement for a staggering diamond necklace. She was desperate to wear stones heavy enough to blind her high society peers to the gaping financial crater opening beneath her custom-heeled shoes. She was treating the launch gala like a royal coronation, aggressively masking the bitter stench of their financial decay with the overpowering scent of imported flowers. On Tuesday morning, 3 days before the event, the physical manifestation of their arrogance arrived at the heavily guarded reception desk of my corporate headquarters. A courier delivered a thick, oversized envelope sealed with dark blue wax bearing the embossed Elite Care crest. My chief legal officer brought the envelope directly to my penthouse, setting it on the edge of my obsidian glass desk. I broke the heavy wax seal with a silver letter opener. I slid out the formal VIP invitation, printed on rigid, double-thick cardstock with gleaming silver foil lettering. It was addressed to the esteemed founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Health Networks. The text of the invitation was drenched in unearned superiority. It read less like a professional corporate gathering and more like a summons to witness the birth of a dynasty. They even included a handwritten note from Everett clipped to the back of the card, expressing his profound anticipation of standing shoulder to shoulder with a fellow titan of industry. I traced my finger over the silver foil, feeling the raised lettering beneath my calloused fingertips. They were rolling out the red carpet, hiring a string quartet, and inviting 500 of the most powerful people in the city, all to honor a woman they had publicly labeled a parasitic failure. I set the invitation down beside my dual monitors. I did not need to prepare a lengthy speech or practice fake pleasantries in front of a mirror. My preparation was entirely tactical. I walked into my expansive, cedar-lined walk-in closet, bypassing the faded gray sweaters and modest denim I wore when navigating the city undetected. The time for blending into the shadows had officially expired. I reached for the armor I reserved exclusively for corporate executions. I selected a bespoke, charcoal gray power suit tailored perfectly to my frame. The virgin wool fabric was heavy, structured, and projected a cold, unyielding authority. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and polished black leather boots, ensuring every single physical detail communicated absolute, terrifying control. My mother had spent her entire life judging people by their aesthetic packaging, believing my casual attire was a reflection of a messy, undisciplined mind. When I walked through the mahogany doors of their glittering ballroom, I wanted them to realize instantly that they were not looking at a broken medical school dropout begging for scraps. They were looking at an apex predator stepping onto her own killing floor. With my physical presentation finalized, I returned to my command center to arm the digital explosives. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, waking my monitors with a rapid keystroke. I opened the highly restricted communication channel to my shadow legal team. I instructed my chief legal officer to finalize the federal filings. We packaged Grayson's pirated server logs, compiling the unencrypted patient data, the time-stamped wire fraud, and the documented Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act violations into a single, undeniable digital dossier. I ordered the legal team to prepare the official submissions for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission, holding them on a strict hair-trigger release. I then reviewed the finalized cross-collateralization contracts containing the lethal default covenants my father had blindly agreed to. I authorized my security director to deploy a tactical unit of 4 elite corporate operatives, instructing them to secure the perimeter of the Plaza Hotel ballroom and await my arrival. The spring was coiled to its absolute maximum tension. Every digital lock was fastened. Every legal snare was set in place. My family had spent the last 5 weeks ruthlessly digging their own graves, entirely consumed by their desperation to maintain a flawless aristocratic illusion. They spent their last remaining dollars polishing the brass on a sinking ship, completely unaware that I was already holding the detonator. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of crystal chandeliers, imported orchids, and the overwhelming stench of desperate ambition. The $85,000 Sylvia had funneled into the superficial aesthetics of the room manifested in cascading, rare white blooms draping every marbled pillar and archway. Over 500 elite guests, state senators, hospital administrators, venture capitalists, and pharmaceutical executives mingled shoulder to shoulder on the polished floor. Their bespoke tuxedos and designer silk gowns rustled in a synchronized, chaotic dance of performative wealth. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated silently through the dense crowd, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne. The ambient hum of clinking crystal and hushed, calculating laughter echoed sharply against the vaulted, frescoed ceilings. The room reeked of expensive colognes and heavy floral perfumes, a thick, suffocating mask designed to hide the bitter scent of my family's impending bankruptcy. At the far end of the sprawling room, a heavily illuminated, elevated stage dominated the space. Everett stood squarely behind a clear acrylic podium, bathed in the harsh, blinding glare of a theatrical spotlight. He gripped the edges of the transparent plastic structure, his knuckles turning stark white as he leaned forward to project his voice through the high-definition surround sound system. He wore a custom midnight blue tuxedo, his broad chest puffed outward as he surveyed his captive audience. For 3 generations, the Bellamy name has represented the absolute pinnacle of medical excellence, Everett declared, his voice echoing with practiced, unearned superiority. He gestured widely with his right hand, basking in the polite applause of the crowd, ignoring the fine sheen of sweat building on his forehead. Tonight, we do not just open a clinic. We completely redefine the very nature of concierge care, and we do this alongside a true titan of the digital age. He paused, letting the silence stretch across the ballroom, soaking in the rapt attention of his peers. In mere moments, the anonymous visionary behind Aegis Health Networks will join me on this very stage, Everett boasted, his face flushing a deep, triumphant red. We will officially finalize a $50 million operational partnership, marrying our superior medical lineage with their unmatched logistical architecture. They recognize our unmatched potential. Elite care is not just the future of medicine, it is an impenetrable fortress of healing. Below the elevated stage, Sylvia glided through the front rows of VIP tables. She moved with a practiced, predatory grace, her face frozen in a tight, camera-ready smile. The heavy diamond necklace she had rented for the evening rested against her collarbone, catching the blinding light of the overhead chandeliers and scattering fractured rainbows across the lapels of the local politicians she cornered. She placed her manicured hand on the arm of a prominent municipal health inspector, laughing far too loudly at a joke she clearly did not find funny. Her fingers constantly drifted to her throat, nervously checking the clasp of the rented jewels. Her eyes darted relentlessly toward the heavy mahogany entrance doors. A faint, erratic twitch, betraying the raw panic bubbling just beneath her flawless exterior. She was actively scanning the crowd, desperate for the $50 million savior to arrive and validate her expensive masquerade before the institutional lenders pulled the plug. Near the catering stations on the right flank of the room, Grayson leaned heavily against a high-top table. His bespoke charcoal suit was slightly wrinkled at the elbows, and a thick layer of cold sweat coated his face. He gripped a crystal tumbler filled to the brim with dark amber bourbon, the ice clinking sharply as he swirled the liquid with jerky, uncoordinated movements. He laughed aggressively at a comment made by a junior surgical resident, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. "Compliance protocols are for cowards and public hospital hacks," Grayson slurred, taking a massive, desperate gulp of his drink. He spilled a single drop of bourbon onto his silk lapel and instantly cursed at a passing waiter, blaming the staff for his own lack of equilibrium. He tipped his head back and swallowed the rest of the liquor, signaling for an immediate refill. He believed his pirated beta demonstration had successfully duped the banking auditors. He thought he had outsmarted the federal government, entirely oblivious to the documented wire fraud and health compliance violations sitting quietly in my encrypted digital vault. He stood there, adjusting his heavy gold luxury watch, a dead man completely unaware that his medical license had already expired. While my family performed their desperate pantomime of success, my black town car pulled smoothly into the circular driveway of the Plaza Hotel. The heavy tires hissed gently against the damp pavement. I stepped out into the freezing Manhattan night, the frigid air biting against my cheeks. I did not shiver. I smoothed the lapels of my bespoke, charcoal gray power suit. The heavy virgin wool settled perfectly across my shoulders, functioning as a silent, impenetrable suit of armor. I walked up the wide stone steps, moving with a slow, deliberate cadence that perfectly matched the slowing rhythm of my heartbeat. The hotel lobby buzzed with the overflow of the massive event. I navigated the polished marble floors, my black leather boots echoing with a steady, rhythmic thud against the stone. As I approached the entrance to the grand ballroom, the crowd thinned, bottlenecked by a thick, crimson velvet rope. Two burly private security guards flanked the heavy mahogany doors. They wore cheap polyester suits and discreet earpieces, their eyes scanning the incoming guests with aggressive, targeted suspicion. Sylvia had undoubtedly briefed them. Her paranoia regarding my potential interference had likely driven her to provide a highly detailed description of her disgraced, unemployed daughter. She wanted to ensure the unstable parasite did not slip through the cracks and disrupt her $50 million illusion. I stepped directly up to the velvet rope. The guard on the right, a tall man with a thick, corded neck, immediately stepped forward, deliberately shifting his body weight to block my path. He looked at my structured charcoal suit, his eyes narrowing as he cross-referenced my face with the frantic instructions my mother had provided. "I am sorry, ma'am," the guard stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He did not sound sorry at all. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, establishing a rigid physical barricade. "This is a highly restricted, private corporate event. Only verified guests on the Elite Care VIP list are permitted beyond this point. I am going to have to ask you to step back." He anticipated an argument. He braced his shoulders, fully expecting me to raise my voice, demand entry, or cause the exact type of hysterical scene my mother had falsely accused me of orchestrating in the coffee shop. He was prepared to physically escort me out of the lobby, eager to earn his paycheck by neutralizing a perceived threat. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I maintained a posture of absolute, unyielding stillness. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds, forcing him to absorb the freezing, atmospheric pressure of my composure. I reached my right hand slowly into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal blazer. The guard tensed, his hand twitching slightly toward the radio clipped to his belt. I bypassed my smartphone and withdrew a single, rectangular object. I held it up between my index and middle fingers, presenting it directly at his eye level. It was a solid, matte black titanium card. It bore no colorful logos or gaudy promotional text. The surface was pristine, interrupted only by a small, embedded cryptographic microchip and the heavy, embossed silver lettering that read, Aegis Health Networks, founder and majority shareholder. The guard stared at the heavy silver lettering. The aggressive, confrontational posture completely evaporated from his frame. His thick arms dropped instantly to his sides. The color drained rapidly from his face, leaving a sickly pale hue as his brain processed the monumental error he had just made. He realized he was not blocking an unstable, disgraced relative. He was actively obstructing the exact $50 million savior the entire event had been orchestrated to honor. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. His trembling hand reached out and hastily unclipped the brass latch of the velvet rope. I did not raise my voice or argue with the guard. I simply flashed my black titanium majority shareholder card, and the heavy mahogany doors swung wide open. I stepped into the blinding light of the ballroom, the heavy leather soles of my boots striking the polished marble with a slow, lethal cadence. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me, cleanly severing the muffled hum of the hotel lobby and plunging me directly into the suffocating epicenter of my family's delusion. The atmospheric pressure in the room was dense, thick with the overpowering scent of imported white orchids and the metallic tang of chilled vintage champagne, all layered beneath the collective body heat of 500 members of the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung suspended from the vaulted, frescoed ceilings, casting a fractured, blinding glare over the sprawling sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer silk gowns. I did not hug the perimeter of the room. I did not skirt the edges or attempt to blend into the shadows to avoid drawing attention. I stepped directly onto the center walkway, an expansive stretch of polished stone running cleanly down the middle of the ballroom, leading straight to the elevated stage. My charcoal gray power suit absorbed the harsh ambient light, projecting a stark, structured contrast to the glittering, performative excess surrounding me. At first, only the guests lingering near the rear doors noticed my arrival. A venture capitalist paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he lowered his crystal tumbler, taking in the unsmiling woman striding confidently through a room designed exclusively for celebration. The people adjacent to him turned. A hushed murmur began to ripple through the dense crowd, spreading rapidly like a drop of black ink expanding in a glass of clear water. The guests instinctively parted, taking half steps backward to clear the center aisle. They did not know who I was, but they recognized the absolute, chilling authority radiating from my posture. They yielded the floor. Near the front row of VIP tables, Sylvia was actively cornering a group of state senators. She was in the middle of a sharp, practiced laugh, her head tilted back to maximize the light catching her heavily insured diamond necklace. The shifting energy of the room caught her attention. She turned her head, irritated by the distraction, her eyes scanning the parted crowd until they locked onto my face. The transition from glittering, triumphant hostess to paralyzed prey was instantaneous. The blood drained completely from her cheeks, leaving her face a stark, chalky white beneath her heavy, baked-on cosmetics. Her jaw went completely slack. The muscles in her fingers gave out entirely. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from her manicured hand, plummeting toward the polished floor. The glass shattered with a sharp, violent crack that echoed loudly above the hushed whispers of the crowd. A spray of vintage champagne and crystal shards exploded across the hem of her pristine designer gown, the dark liquid rapidly seeping into the pristine white fabric. Sylvia did not flinch. She did not look down to brush away the glass. She remained entirely frozen, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths. Staring at the disgraced daughter she believed she had successfully banished. Up on the elevated stage, Everett was entirely oblivious to the shifting atmospheric pressure on the floor below. He stood squarely behind the clear acrylic podium, leaning heavily into the microphone. The anonymous founder of Aegis Health Networks possesses a brilliant, uncompromising mind, Everett proclaimed, his voice booming through the high-definition speakers. They are a visionary who understands the absolute necessity of rigorous discipline and unparalleled excellence traits that have been the bedrock of the Bellamy family for generations. This partnership will cement elite care as an absolute, untouchable pillar of imi ofracuas. The sharp crack of Sylvia's shattering glass severed his sentence. He blinked, annoyed by the sudden interruption, and squinted past the harsh, blinding glare of the theatrical spotlight to locate the source of the noise. His gaze tracked from my petrified mother, past the frozen senators, and down the wide, empty aisle the crowd had formed. His eyes followed the path backward, finally resting on my approaching figure. The transformation was visceral. The practiced, benevolent mask of the visionary medical patriarch violently snapped in two. A deep mottled red flush crept rapidly up his thick neck, coloring his jawline and spreading aggressively across his forehead. The veins at his temples began to pulse visibly under the bright stage lights. He gripped the edges of the transparent podium so fiercely his knuckles turned stark white. He leaned aggressively into the microphone, the speakers whining with a brief, high-pitched shriek of feedback. "Security!" Everett roared, his voice amplified to a deafening volume that rattled the crystal fixtures above. The polished, diplomatic tone he had been utilizing seconds prior was completely eradicated, replaced by a raw, unhinged fury. "Where is the hotel security? Remove this woman immediately." I did not stop walking. I maintained my steady, measured pace, closing the distance between the rear doors and the elevated stage. "You have lost your absolute mind. Quinn!" Everett shouted, abandoning the podium and ripping the wireless microphone from its stand. He paced to the edge of the stage, towering over the crowd, using his physical elevation to project absolute dominance. The 500 elite guests were dead silent, watching the grotesque public spectacle unfold with morbid fascination. "Did you honestly believe you could crash a $50 million gala in that cheap suit and demand a handout?" he mocked, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. He gestured widely with his free hand, explicitly inviting the wealthy crowd to join in his ridicule. "We are minutes away from finalizing a partnership with a global tech titan, and you chose this exact moment to drag your personal failures into my ballroom. Did you think throwing a tantrum in front of my investors would force me to open my checkbook? We cut you off for a reason. You are a disgraceful dropout, and you will not extort a single dollar from this family to fund your miserable, unemployed existence." Over by the catering tables on the right flank, I saw Grayson push his way violently to the front of the crowd. His bespoke charcoal suit was rumpled, his face flushed with heavy bourbon and absolute panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me, shouting an insult that was entirely lost beneath the echoing boom of our father's microphone. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not inform the 500 staring guests that the woman my father was publicly mocking as a penniless beggar was actually the sole proprietor of a $68,400,000 fortune. Let him dig the trench deeper. Let him broadcast his supreme arrogance to every political and financial heavyweight in the room. I reached the base of the carpeted stairs leading up to the stage. 2 hotel security guards, spurred by Everett's screaming commands, finally broke through the crowd, rushing toward my back with their arms outstretched to grab my shoulders and forcefully drag me out of the building. They never made contact. From the shadows of the flanking archways, 4 imposing figures materialized with terrifying, synchronized precision. They moved with the silent, lethal grace of apex predators entering an enclosure of nervous prey. They did not wear the cheap polyester suits of the hotel staff. They wore tailored black Kevlar-lined jackets and discreet earpieces. They were the elite corporate security operatives from Aegis Health Networks, deployed specifically to lock down the perimeter of my killing floor. Two of the operatives pivoted smoothly, intercepting the hotel guards with effortless, brutal efficiency. They did not throw punches. One operative clamped a massive hand over the hotel guard's radio, severing his communication line, while stepping directly into his path, utilizing his superior mass to drive the guard backward. They pinned the hotel staff silently against the marble pillars, neutralizing the threat in less than 3 seconds without making a single sound. The remaining two operatives flanked me instantly, stepping into perfect formation at my left and right shoulders. I placed my leather boot on the first carpeted step. I ascended the stairs to the elevated stage in total, unbroken silence. Everett stopped pacing. He stood at the edge of the platform, the wireless microphone gripped tightly in his sweating hand, fully expecting me to cower or retreat under the crushing weight of his public humiliation. Instead, I stepped onto his territory, bringing my elite security detail directly into his personal space. My operatives stepped forward, instantly forming an impenetrable wall of tailored black fabric and hardened muscle between my father and myself. They crossed their wrists in front of their belts, staring straight ahead, completely isolating Everett from the acrylic podium and his own event. The arrogant smirk completely melted off my father's face the exact second my security detail locked down the perimeter of his own stage. The suffocating silence of the room was heavy enough to crush bone, and I was the only one still breathing. The ambient hum of 500 whispered conversations had been entirely eradicated. The only sound in the massive, frescoed ballroom was the ragged, wheezing intake of oxygen rattling inside my father's throat. He stared at the 4 elite security operatives blocking him from his own podium, his eyes darting frantically between their hardened, unblinking expressions and the heavy black Kevlar lining of their tailored jackets. The aggressive, towering posture he had weaponized his entire life crumbled beneath the blinding heat of the theatrical spotlight. I stepped forward, slicing directly through the center of my security detail. They parted seamlessly, granting me an unobstructed path to the man who had publicly banished me exactly 35 days prior. Everett's pristine midnight blue tuxedo suddenly looked 2 sizes too large. The heavy vein pulsing at his temple flattened out. He was physically trembling. The heavy silver microphone shook violently in his hand, the metal grill clicking rhythmically against his gold signet ring. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and wrapped my calloused fingers firmly over the cool metal of the microphone shaft, resting my hand directly above his sweating grip. For a fraction of a second, his knuckles whitened as he desperately attempted to hold on to his remaining authority. I simply locked my eyes onto his, tilting my chin the slightest fraction of an inch, letting the freezing, atmospheric pressure of my composure bear down on him. The resistance broke. His fingers went completely limp. I pulled the microphone from his grasp. I stepped past his shrinking frame and took my position behind the clear acrylic podium. I looked out over the sprawling sea of imported white orchids and bespoke formal wear. 500 of the city's most influential medical executives, politicians, and venture capitalists stared back at me in absolute paralysis. I located the institutional loan officers sitting at the center VIP table, their custom suits rigid, their eyes narrowed in predatory confusion as they tried to process the hostile takeover happening on the stage they had funded. I brought the microphone to my lips. "Good evening," I said. My voice did not echo with manufactured bombast or desperate theatrics. It was a low, steady current of ice cutting cleanly through the stifling heat of the room. My father was just speaking to you regarding the absolute necessity of rigorous discipline and unparalleled excellence. He was attempting to introduce the anonymous founder of the digital architecture that is legally required to keep this facility operational. I paused, letting the heavy syllables settle over the crowd. I turned my head slightly, locking my gaze onto Sylvia. She was still frozen by the front tables, a massive stain of spilled vintage champagne slowly expanding across the front of her pristine, white designer gown. Her rented diamond necklace caught the light, a glittering anchor pulling her down into the reality she had spent thousands of dollars attempting to avoid. He assumed the founder would be a stranger. I continued, turning my attention back to the 500 guests. Allow me to formally introduce myself. My name is Quinn Bellamy. I am the sole founder, the chief software architect, and the chief executive officer of Aegis Health Networks. The words struck the ballroom like physical shrapnel. To my immediate left, Everett physically collapsed, his knees buckled completely, the customized fabric of his trousers snapping tightly as he dropped heavily onto the carpeted stage. He landed on his hands and knees, gasping for air as the monumental weight of his catastrophic error crushed the remaining oxygen from his lungs. He was staring at the polished toes of my black leather boots, entirely incapable of looking upward. Near the catering stations on the right flank, the color violently drained from Grayson's face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent gray mask. The crystal tumbler slipped from his paralyzed fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments, a pool of expensive amber bourbon rapidly spreading across the stone. He stumbled backward, his shoulder blades hitting the heavy mahogany paneling of the wall as the alcohol-induced arrogance violently evaporated from his system. The absolute terror in his eyes confirmed that he finally understood exactly whose digital fortress he had attempted to blindly hack. I reached into the pocket of my charcoal blazer and withdrew a small, matte black remote. I aimed it directly at the audiovisual control booth suspended above the rear doors of the ballroom. I pressed a single button. The massive, high-definition digital screens flanking the stage, previously displaying the rotating, gilded logo of Elite Care flickered aggressively. The golden crests vanished, instantly replaced by the stark, sterile interface of my encrypted corporate inbox. I amplified the resolution, projecting the text so massively that even the guests standing near the rear exits could read the precise punctuation. My father spoke of a mutual professional respect, I stated, gesturing toward the 50-foot screens. He claimed a close personal friendship with the Aegis founder to secure his $50 million commercial draw. I believe in absolute, data-driven truth. Let us review the precise nature of that friendship. I clicked the remote again. The screens illuminated with the frantic, time-stamped emails Everett had sent me in the dead of night. The fawning, pathetic words glowed fiercely under the chandeliers. The crowd leaned in, their eyes scanning the desperate pleas. They read the exact sentences where the commanding medical patriarch had groveled, praising the visionary brilliance of the Aegis founder. They read the explicit offers to waive all standard negotiation phases, the begging tone completely contradicting the arrogant, untouchable image he had projected just moments before, a collective. Physical recoil rippled through the front rows. The venture capitalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the grim reality of Everett's desperation exposing a severe lack of leverage. Desperation often breeds extreme concessions, I continued, my voice maintaining its chilling, even cadence. The board of Aegis Health Networks required absolute financial transparency before finalizing a logistics contract of this magnitude. When an institution offers to drastically inflate their own licensing fees to bypass standard security protocols, one must examine the underlying structural integrity of the clinic. I pressed the button a third time. The desperate emails vanished, replaced by the highly classified, internal financial ledgers of Elite Care. The raw, unfiltered audit my shadow legal team had compiled expanded across the massive screens. There were no gilded logos. There was only a devastating ocean of red ink. I isolated the primary debt covenants, highlighting the cascading columns of toxic commercial debt. I displayed the completely frozen operational accounts. I projected the exact deficit, $50 million of unyielding institutional leverage. I highlighted the absolute zero balance in their liquid reserve accounts. The screens mapped out the undeniable, mathematical reality that without my immediate signature on the partnership agreement, the Bellamy medical dynasty did not possess the capital required to purchase a single roll of surgical gauze. You were invited here tonight to witness the birth of a medical empire, I announced, looking directly down at the senior loan officers seated at the VIP table. Their faces were entirely devoid of blood, their eyes fixed in absolute horror on the screens as they realized their massive investment was actively burning to the ground. Instead, you have been invited to a heavily mortgaged stage play. Elite Care is not an impenetrable fortress of healing. It is massively over-leveraged, entirely bankrupt, and structurally dependent on a digital lifeline they do not possess. I looked down at the crumpled, shivering mass of midnight blue tuxedo resting by my boots. Everett gripped the carpet fibers, a low, wet sob catching in the back of his throat. He had spent his entire life manipulating optics, burying his failures under thick layers of imported flowers and expensive tailoring. I had just forcibly dragged his darkest, most closely guarded financial secrets into the blinding light, projecting his complete and total ruin to the very people he desperately needed to impress. The elite crowd gasped in synchronized horror as the pristine illusion of the Bellamy medical dynasty was brutally stripped away under the blinding stage lights. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel remained perfectly still. "You cannot do this to your own blood," my father shrieked, his polished executive facade violently shattering into raw, unadulterated panic. He scrambled awkwardly off the carpeted floor, his heavy wingtip shoes slipping against the polished wood base of the stage. His midnight blue tuxedo jacket rode up awkwardly around his waist. He lunged toward the clear acrylic podium, his sweating hands violently grappling for the silver microphone resting securely in my grip. My elite security operatives did not even need to draw their weapons. Two of the men simply stepped forward, their massive Kevlar-lined shoulders forming an impenetrable wall. They planted their hands flat against my father's chest and shoved him backward with clinical, devastating force. Everett stumbled, his arms wine-milling wildly before he collapsed against the heavy velvet curtain draping the back of the stage. Denied the amplification of the high-definition speakers, Everett resorted to screaming raw, unamplified syllables at the massive crowd. "She is lying!" he roared, spit flying from his pale lips, his chest heaving with frantic, ragged breaths. "These are fabricated documents. This is a malicious smear campaign orchestrated by a deeply disturbed, estranged daughter. Elite Care is fully funded. We are a pillar of the medical community." The 500 elite guests did not murmur in agreement. They did not rally to his defense. They remained entirely paralyzed in the suffocating silence, their eyes darting between the sweating, unhinged patriarch thrashing on the stage and the colossal digital screens projecting his undeniable financial ruin. Down in the front row, the senior loan officers from the institutional banking syndicate were already moving. They were not looking at Everett. They had their heads bowed over their glowing smartphones, frantically dialing their risk management directors, their faces illuminated by the harsh white light of their screens as they scrambled to contain the catastrophic fallout of their $50 million exposure. I did not argue with my father. I did not raise my voice to shout over his pathetic, echoing denials. I simply shifted my thumb over the matte black remote resting in my palm and pressed the center button. The massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered, shedding the ocean of red financial ledgers. The high-definition panels instantly filled with stark, black backgrounds overlaid with rapid, cascading lines of green and white code, the visual representation of a digital slaughter. A collective intake of breath rippled through the ballroom as the guests tried to interpret the raw data. I brought the microphone to my lips, my voice a sharp, freezing scalpel slicing through the ambient panic. "My father insists on absolute excellence," I stated. The massive speakers projecting my calm, measured cadence into every corner of the room. He built this entire launch gala around the premise that Elite Care possesses an impenetrable, cutting-edge logistical framework. Let us examine the exact methodology his chief of neurosurgery utilized to achieve that operational readiness. I isolated the server logs on the massive screens. I highlighted the specific Internet protocol addresses and the unique media access control signatures. I projected the exact timestamps, blowing the digits up to a massive scale. Exactly 48 hours ago, an unauthorized terminal located within the Elite Care Executive Administrative Suites attempted a brute force breach against the Tier 1 federal security firewalls of Aegis Health Networks, I explained, tracking the data flow on the screens with a digital laser pointer. The terminal belonged to Dr. Grayson Bellamy. Over by the catering stations, the sound of tearing fabric and crashing metal interrupted my presentation. Grayson had attempted to back away from the crowd, entirely consumed by blinding terror. His leather shoe caught the edge of a heavy silver catering tray, resting on a stand. The entire structure collapsed, sending dozens of crystal champagne flutes shattering onto the marble floor. Grayson fell to his knees amid the ruined glass. He wrapped his arms around his stomach, his bespoke charcoal suit absorbing the spilled alcohol as his shoulders heaved. He was violently dry heaving onto the polished stone, his arrogant, golden boy illusion entirely liquefied by the sheer gravity of his federal exposure. The crowd actively recoiled from him, the venture capitalists and politicians taking large, frantic steps backward to avoid the splatter, treating him like an active biological hazard. I clicked the remote again. The screens shifted to display the exact contents of the data packets Grayson had attempted to force through the pirated beta script. The names and social security numbers were heavily redacted with black bars to protect the innocent, but the diagnostic codes and the sheer volume of the files were undeniably clear. To successfully spoof a functional logistics dashboard for his banking auditors, Dr. Bellamy bypassed standard, encrypted onboarding protocols, I announced, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, lethal weight of a judge reading a final sentence. He purchased a pirated, open-source beta script from a shadow developer. He then uploaded an unencrypted database containing over 800 highly sensitive, protected patient neurological records, transmitting them across unsecured state lines directly into a federal defense node. A sharp, horrified gasp erupted from the cluster of hospital administrators seated near the center aisle. They understood the exact legal magnitude of the data currently displayed on the 50-foot screens. They recognized the death penalty of medical compliance. As a primary federal contractor managing supply chain data for the United States government, I continued, locking my gaze onto my father, who was now weeping openly against the velvet curtain. Aegis Health Networks is legally bound by absolute, non-negotiable reporting mandates. I do not possess the authority to bury this. We are mandated to report any unencrypted transmission of protected health information. I looked down at Grayson, who was currently curled into a fetal position amid the shattered crystal, weeping into his hands. Exactly 12 minutes before I walked through those mahogany doors, I stated. My chief legal officer electronically submitted the entirety of these server logs, including the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and catastrophic health insurance portability and Accountability Act violations, directly to the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sylvia finally moved. She dropped to her knees, the heavy diamond necklace dragging against the collar of her ruined white gown. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a long, high-pitched wail that sounded entirely alien in the refined, frescoed ballroom. Everett clawed his way forward, gripping the carpeted edge of the elevated stage. "We signed the Vanguard contract," he screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "We gave you everything you asked for. We offered our estates. You have your licensing fees. You cannot legally destroy the clinic if the partnership is active." I looked down at his tear-streaked face. The final trap was primed. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds before I delivered the lethal blow. "You assumed the Vanguard compliance covenants were standard operational guidelines," I said softly, yet the microphone amplified the lethal whisper throughout the entire venue. "You also assumed your commercial lenders were an independent, untouchable entity." I pressed the final button on the remote. The screen shifted away from the server logs, projecting a massive, legally certified transfer deed. The document was stamped with the glowing blue digital seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The senior loan officers in the front row stared at the screens, their jaws dropping in synchronized shock as they read the specific routing numbers of their own syndication blocks. 24 hours ago, Utilizing a discreet corporate proxy, Aegis Financial Holdings purchased the entirety of Elite Care's toxic commercial debt on the secondary market, I revealed, the absolute chilling truth settling over the room like a heavy winter snowfall. I acquired the $50 million block at a distressed premium. I did not just provide your software, Everett. I own your debt. Everett's mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish pulled from the freezing depths. He could not comprehend the sheer, architectural scale of his destruction. The Vanguard partnership you blindly signed to secure your final bank draw contained strict, non-negotiable cross-collateralization clauses, I explained, mapping the exact legal mechanisms on the glowing screens, because your son just committed documented federal felonies using your primary administrative servers. Elite Care has catastrophically failed the compliance audit required to maintain the loan. I stepped out from behind the clear acrylic podium, walking to the absolute edge of the stage, looking directly down at the shattered patriarch. The grace periods are entirely waived, I commanded, my voice echoing with final, absolute authority. The default covenants are instantly active. As the primary holder of your $50 million debt, I am legally triggering the immediate foreclosure of Elite Care. Furthermore, per the exact terms you offered in your frantic, begging emails, I am seizing the primary suburban estate, your luxury vehicles, and every single active family trust account you pledged as collateral. They had absolutely nothing left. Their money, their prestige, their untouchable medical lineage, it was all entirely eradicated, burned to ash under the blinding heat of their own staggering incompetence. I had stripped away every single layer of their armor, leaving them completely naked and exposed before the exact society they had ruthlessly worshipped. I looked down at the men who had thrown me into the freezing rain, watching them suffocate under the crushing weight of their own monumental greed. Grayson collapsed onto the hollow wooden floorboards, weeping like a terrified child as the sirens began to wail in the distance. He had dragged himself away from the catering station, leaving the shattered crystal and spilled amber bourbon behind, his knees scraping across the temporary, polished oak dance floor installed directly over the ballroom's marble. The bespoke charcoal suit he had worn like a suit of armor just 20 minutes prior was completely saturated, heavy with the stench of liquor and failure. He crawled toward the elevated stage, his chest heaving with rapid, uncontrollable spasms. The golden child, the supposedly untouchable chief of neurosurgery, was reduced to a hyperventilating, pathetic mess clawing at the carpeted bottom step of the platform. "Quinn, please," Grayson begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, reedy whine that carried across the silent room. He pressed his sweating forehead against the fabric of the stairs, refusing to look up at my elite corporate security operatives. "I will do anything. You own the servers, you hold the administrative encryption keys. You can just log in right now and delete the files, erase the network logs. Please. Quinn." He reached out a trembling, liquor-soaked hand, his fingers grasping blindly at the air inches from my leather boots. "I cannot go to a federal penitentiary," Grayson babbled, the words spilling out in a rapid, unintelligible rush of pure terror. "I would not survive a week in there. I am a neurosurgeon. I belong in an operating theater, not a concrete cell. I will resign my medical license voluntarily tomorrow morning. I will scrub the biohazard bins. I will mop the floors of your corporate lobby every single night for the rest of my life. I will disappear completely. Just do not let them take me. Wipe the digital footprint. You have to save me." Before I could even register the absolute pathetic absurdity of his offer, Sylvia violently shattered the remaining space between us. She lurched forward from the VIP tables, her expensive custom heels snapping aggressively against the wooden floorboards. She stumbled, nearly losing her balance, but caught the edge of the stage with her manicured hands. The heavy, rented, diamond necklace swung wildly around her neck, a glittering, $85,000 chain pulling her down into the abyss. The vintage champagne stain on her pristine white designer gown had oxidized, turning the expensive silk a sickly, bruised yellow under the blinding stage lights, thick, Black rivers of waterproof mascara ran down her cheeks, carving dark trenches through the heavy layers of baked-on foundation she had applied to Project Infinite Wealth. Her eyes were wide, entirely unhinged, burning with a frantic, desperate delusion. "You are my daughter!" Sylvia shrieked, her voice tearing violently at her own vocal cords. The sound was a raw, primal screech that forced several venture capitalists in the front row to physically wince. "A daughter does not do this to her own mother. We gave you absolutely everything. We provided the untouchable Bellamy name. We fed you. We clothed you. We allowed you to walk in the shadow of our greatness." She slammed her open palms against the carpeted edge of the stage, her chest heaving as she attempted to weaponize the very emotional bonds she had spent my entire life systematically destroying. "You must protect your family," Sylvia screamed, her voice echoing off the frescoed ceilings. "You will withdraw the federal filings right this second. Quinn, you will tell the Department of Justice it was a security glitch, a false positive generated by your own defective software. You have the power to stop this, and you owe us your loyalty." I stood behind the clear acrylic podium, perfectly centered in the blinding heat of the theatrical spotlight. I did not step back. I did not soften my posture. I looked down at the weeping, trembling neurosurgeon clutching the stairs, and the shrieking, delusional socialite pounding her fists against the stage. I thought back to the freezing rain outside the suburban estate 35 days ago, to the exact moment they had locked the heavy oak doors in my face and told me to never return until I had learned my proper place. I raised the silver microphone to my lips. "You did not give me a family," I stated. My voice was a low, steady current of absolute zero ice, cutting cleanly through the frantic, suffocating heat of their panic. "You provided a transaction. You demanded total, unquestioning compliance and actively punished independence. You built a $50 million medical facility not to heal the sick, not to advance the boundaries of neurological science, but to erect a massive, marble-lined monument to your own fragile, insatiable egos." The distant wail of the sirens grew significantly louder, multiplying in number. The mechanical, high-pitched shrieks began to pierce directly through the thick, frosted glass windows of the grand ballroom, bleeding into the ambient acoustics of the room. The flashing red and blue strobes of emergency light bars began to reflect faintly against the crystal chandeliers, casting an eerie, chaotic pulse over the imported white orchids. I looked directly into Sylvia's unhinged, tear-streaked face. "You aggressively chose prestige over people," I declared, my words dropping like heavy iron anvils onto the silent crowd. "You chose the flawless illusion of superiority over the messy, data-driven reality of your own monumental incompetence. You built a towering castle on a foundation of leverage, wire fraud, and extortion, genuinely believing your last name granted you immunity from the laws of gravity. And now, the final ledger is perfectly balanced. You possess neither prestige nor people. You have absolutely nothing left." The mechanical wailing of the sirens outside abruptly ceased, replaced by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots marching rapidly across the hotel lobby's marble floor. The sound was deafening, a relentless drumbeat of impending consequence rapidly closing the distance to the ballroom. The massive oak doors at the back of the ballroom burst open with a concussive, violent force. The heavy wood slammed backward against the plastered walls, shattering the brass hinges. Over 24 federal agents flooded the center aisle. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision, a phalanx of men and women wearing reinforced, dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow. Block letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured into the room. They were immediately flanked by senior regulators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, dressed in sharp bureaucratic gray suits, carrying heavy leather briefcases packed with the physical warrants generated from my encrypted digital submissions. They did not pause to admire the cascading white orchids or the towering crystal chandeliers. They did not hesitate at the velvet ropes. They marched directly down the center aisle, their hands resting securely on their heavy utility belts, their eyes locked in dead, Professional focus on the elevated stage. Dr. Everett Bellamy, Dr. Grayson Bellamy. The lead federal agent bellowed, his voice carrying the raw, undeniable authority of the United States government. Do not move. The 500 elite guests, the exact people my family had spent their last borrowed dollars to impress. The state senators who had gladly sipped their vintage champagne just 20 minutes prior violently recoiled. They scrambled backward in a blind, terrified stampede. VIP tables were knocked over, sending towering floral centerpieces and silver catering trays crashing to the floor. Nobody wanted their face captured in the background of a massive federal raid. They pulled their expensive phones out, turning their backs on my father and brother, desperately pretending they had absolutely no association with the Bellamy family. The lead federal agent bypassed the shattered velvet ropes and rapidly ascended the stage stairs. He read the Miranda rights with a bored, clinical efficiency that perfectly highlighted the absolute finality of the moment. Two tactical agents grabbed Grayson by the lapels of his ruined charcoal blazer. Hauling his dead weight off the wooden floorboards, he went entirely limp, sobbing uncontrollably into his chest, his legs dragging behind him. Another pair of agents lifted Everett from the stage carpet. My father did not fight back. His eyes were vacant, entirely hollowed out by the sheer magnitude of his financial and professional obliteration. The elite politicians and wealthy investors scrambled into the shadows like cockroaches, desperately avoiding the blast radius as federal agents placed my father and brother in heavy steel handcuffs. The glittering launch gala emptied in a matter of minutes, leaving only the shattered crystal and the echoing reality of their absolute ruin. The 500 elite guests, the venture capitalists, the state senators, and the hospital administrators did not simply leave the grand ballroom. They fled in a blind, terrified stampede. They rushed the heavy mahogany exits, desperately fighting to distance themselves from the catastrophic blast radius of federal indictments. They left behind a devastating physical trail of their panic. Overturned silver catering trays spilled heaps of beluga caviar onto the polished marble. Shattered champagne flutes formed a jagged, glittering carpet across the floorboards. Cashmere wraps and designer silk suit jackets were abandoned on the backs of chairs, completely forgotten by powerful people who recognized that being photographed anywhere near the Bellamy family was now professional suicide. Up on the elevated stage, the federal agents moved with clinical, unforgiving efficiency. I stood perfectly still behind the clear acrylic podium, flanked by my 4 elite corporate operatives, watching the physical dismantling of my father's untouchable illusion. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Everett's wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the suddenly cavernous room, the steel biting deep into the sleeves of his custom midnight blue tuxedo. He did not possess the strength to stand on his own. 2 agents had to grip him under his armpits to keep him upright, his polished wingtip shoes dragging awkwardly across the carpet. Grayson was in a far worse state. The golden child, the arrogant chief of neurosurgery, was actively hyperventilating. His saturated, liquor-soaked charcoal blazer was wrinkled and covered in the dust of the floorboards. He was weeping openly, a thick line of saliva hanging from his chin as the agents physically hauled his dead weight down the center aisle. As the tactical unit dragged them through the shattered velvet ropes of the hotel lobby and pushed them through the heavy front doors, the flashing red and blue emergency strobes were violently joined by the blinding, rapid-fire flashes of the local press. The paparazzi and investigative journalists, alerted to the massive federal raid of a $50 million medical launch, swarmed the Plaza Hotel steps. I watched the live feeds on my smartphone. The blinding white flashes illuminated Everett's hollow. Terrified eyes and Grayson's tear-streaked face shouted questions regarding wire fraud and stolen patient data, cut through the freezing night air, permanently capturing their absolute public humiliation as they were shoved aggressively into the back of heavily armored federal transport vehicles. Inside the grand ballroom, the heavy doors swung shut, sealing off the cacophony of the press pool and the wailing sirens. The space was suddenly suffocatingly quiet. Sylvia knelt completely alone in the center of the shattered crystal and spilled vintage champagne. The $85,000 worth of imported white orchids draping the archways above her already seemed to droop, browning at the edges under the harsh glare of the remaining stage lights. The heavy diamond necklace she had rented to project an aura of infinite, untouchable wealth now looked remarkably like cheap, fragile glass resting against her bruised, yellowed silk gown. She was shivering violently, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her torso in a desperate attempt to hold her fracturing reality together. She looked up at the elevated stage. The thick, black streaks of ruined mascara carved dark trenches through her heavy, baked-on foundation. Her eyes locked onto mine. Her expression was a frantic, terrified plea. She was silently begging for the disgraced, a raised daughter to descend the carpeted stairs and offer the unconditional comfort she had spent 28 years denying me. She wanted me to reach down, pull her from the wreckage, and tell her everything would be fine. I did not move toward her. I did not offer a single syllable of manufactured sympathy. I simply smoothed the lapels of my bespoke, charcoal gray power suit, the heavy virgin wool functioning as an impenetrable shield against her toxic emotional gravity. I held her gaze for 3 long, absolute seconds, ensuring she completely understood the permanence of the silence between us. Then, I turned my back to the weeping socialite, flanked by my security detail. I walked steadily down the rear steps of the stage and exited through the restricted service corridors, leaving her completely alone in the sprawling graveyard of her own vanity. The destruction I had engineered executed itself with lethal, automated precision over the following 48 hours. The institutional lenders I had bypassed did not hesitate, because I held the $50 million commercial debt and had legally triggered the immediate default covenants. The asset recovery teams were deployed before the sun even rose on Monday morning. I sat at my obsidian glass desk in my penthouse, sipping a glass of iced water as I monitored the encrypted feeds. Heavy moving trucks idled in the circular driveway of the sprawling Bellamy suburban estate. Armed recovery agents marched straight through the heavy oak doors, the exact doors Everett had slammed in my face exactly 35 days prior. I watched the live perimeter cameras as the agents physically removed the antique furniture, the imported artwork, and the heavy mahogany desks. A separate automotive recovery crew loaded their luxury, imported sports cars onto the back of flatbed tow trucks. By noon, a heavy steel padlock and a thick chain were clamped onto the wrought iron front gates, officially locking the Bellamy family out of the very kingdom they had weaponized against me. The professional obliteration followed instantly, striking with the devastating force of a federal hammer. The state medical board did not convene a lengthy, bureaucratic review panel or offer a grace period. The digital dossier my shadow legal team had provided, containing Grayson's unencrypted patient data uploads and wire fraud logs, was absolute, mathematically undeniable proof of severe federal felonies. The board issued an immediate emergency suspension of his surgical license on Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the suspension was upgraded to a permanent, irrevocable revocation. Everett's license was similarly shredded. His name was permanently flagged in the National Practitioner Data Bank for catastrophic compliance failures and institutional fraud, ensuring he could never legally prescribe a single aspirin in any state in the country. The gleaming $50 million elite care facility they had attempted to build remained dark and empty. The heavy glass doors were chained shut, the expensive marble lobbies collecting dust, standing as a massive, silent monument to their financial rot. Sitting in my command center, I watched the local news networks project the final act of their demise across my dual monitors. The red, breaking news chyrons scrolled continuously across the bottom of the screens. They displayed the harsh, unflattering mugshots of Everett and Grayson Bellamy directly next to bold, capitalized graphics reading federal indictment and catastrophic fraud. The Bellamy name, once a carefully cultivated illusion of untouchable medical superiority that they had used to beat me into submission, instantly became a toxic liability. It was a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of rival hospitals, a punchline among the city's political elite, completely synonymous with devastating federal crime and crushing hubris. They were bankrupt, disgraced, and facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The toxic empire they had built on arrogance and stolen prestige was permanently reduced to ash, scattered to the wind by the quiet daughter they had so foolishly erased. 6 months later, the brutal Manhattan winter had thawed into a bright, forgiving spring, and the air inside my penthouse felt infinitely lighter. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a warm ceramic mug of coffee, watching the morning sunlight reflect off the sprawling city skyline. No red alerts strobed across my dual monitors, no frantic, manipulative text messages vibrated against the obsidian glass of my desk. The suffocating manufactured chaos that had defined the Bellamy family dynamic was entirely eradicated, replaced by the steady, quiet hum of my corporate servers processing legitimate, encrypted data. I walked over to my command center and opened the final digital brief sent by my chief legal officer, swiping slowly through the encrypted pages that documented the permanent, irreversible consequences of my family's arrogance. The first attachment was a finalized federal sentencing docket. Everett Bellamy, the former patriarch who once demanded absolute obedience from behind a custom mahogany desk, was currently waking up on a thin foam mattress supported by a rigid steel frame. He was actively serving a 5-year sentence in a federal minimum security correctional facility in upstate New York. He wore a standardized, faded khaki uniform that completely erased his carefully curated aura of untouchable prestige. His days of dictating surgical schedules and berating hospital staff were permanently over. The state medical board had formally published his irrevocable disbarment, permanently stripping him of the title he had worshipped above his own children. He was no longer a visionary healer. He was simply federal inmate number 42,816, assigned to the morning laundry detail. Grayson's fate was actively unfolding in a heavily guarded courtroom in the Southern District. The legal updates included photographs of my older brother sitting rigidly at a wooden defense table, flanked by overworked public defenders. He had pawned his heavy gold luxury watch months ago to cover his initial bail requirements. The bespoke charcoal suits were completely gone, replaced by a stiff, off-the-rack polyester jacket that hung awkwardly from his rapidly shrinking, terrified frame. The federal prosecutors were systematically introducing my encrypted server logs into evidence, stacking physical boxes of his documented wire fraud and health compliance violations directly in front of the jury. He was facing severe federal penalties, staring down a decade of mandatory minimums. The golden child, completely stripped of his father's protective financial umbrella, was finally learning the crushing, devastating weight of personal consequence. The most dramatic physical transformation, however, belonged to Sylvia. The asset recovery teams had successfully liquidated the sprawling suburban estate, seizing the imported artwork and the luxury vehicles to satisfy the massive commercial default. My mother's heavily insured diamond necklaces and pristine white cashmere coats were auctioned off to cover their outstanding legal fees. She currently resided in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a forgotten, working-class suburb far beyond the glittering borders of her beloved high society. My private investigators provided a final, concluding photograph to close her file. Sylvia was sitting at a chipped formica table beneath a flickering, buzzing fluorescent bulb. The woman who had once authorized an $85,000 wire transfer for imported white orchids was now clutching a pair of cheap plastic scissors, meticulously clipping a 40-cent discount coupon for canned soup from the Sunday newspaper. Her cell phone never rang. The elite politicians and wealthy wives who used to drink her vintage champagne now actively crossed the street to avoid her, treating the Bellamy name like a highly contagious pathogen. I closed the digital brief, locking the screen and leaving their misery in the encrypted vault where it belonged. I set my coffee mug down on the glass, grabbed my keys, and took the biometric elevator down to the private garage. I bypassed the sleek black town car and drove my modest, unassuming sedan out of the city, trading the towering steel skyscrapers of Manhattan for the rolling green hills and quiet, winding roads of a rural county 2 hours north. I pulled into the freshly paved parking lot of a single-story, red brick building. It did not feature crystal chandeliers or vaulted, frescoed ceilings. There were no imported flowers draping the entrance, and there was absolutely no beluga caviar resting on silver trays. Instead, The building smelled of fresh paint, sterile gauze, and genuine hope. The polished sign mounted above the automatic glass doors read, simply, the Vanguard Community Health Center. Uncle Thomas was already standing near the entrance, wearing a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I walked up to join him on the modest concrete steps. We had built this entire facility from the ground up, fully funding the construction, the medical equipment, and the staff salaries using the liquidated, seized assets from the Elite Care bankruptcy. The $50 million my father had borrowed to build a marble-lined monument to his own ego had been systematically dismantled, completely redirected into a modern pediatric wing and a state-of-the-art diagnostic laboratory for a rural community that had previously lacked basic medical access. A small crowd of local residents, hired nurses, and municipal leaders gathered quietly around the entrance. There was no theatrical spotlight, and I did not stand behind a clear acrylic podium to boast about my lineage. I stood quietly, shoulder to shoulder with the only family member who had ever believed in my potential. Thomas handed me a pair of heavy, oversized silver scissors. Together, we cleanly sliced through the bright red ribbon stretched across the sliding glass doors, officially opening the clinic to the public. I stepped back, sliding my hands into the pockets of my simple denim jacket, and watched the first line of patients walk through the doors. A young mother carried her sleeping toddler into the brightly lit pediatric waiting room. An elderly man checked in at the reception desk to schedule a physical therapy session. They were receiving genuine, life-saving care, directly funded by the ashes of a toxic empire. I watched the medical staff greet them with quiet dignity, a profound, steady warmth blossoming in my chest. I finally realized that true success is entirely measured in tangible impact, not in manufactured optics or public validation. True power isn't found in loud boasts or glittering titles. It belongs to those who build their strength in silence and let their undeniable results do the talking. Have you ever proven your toxic doubters wrong by building your own empire in silence? Let me know your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on reclaiming your worth.